All right, diving in today, folks, we're going deep on something pretty classic, pretty fundamental teleological arguments. Those arguments for God's existence.
Yeah, the ones that basically start by looking around at nature and going, wow, this seems way too intricate and organized to just be random. Yeah.
Exactly. And it's a puzzle that's occupied some seriously bright minds for, well, centuries, really.
Oh, absolutely. And we're not just talking theologians here. I mean, philosophers, scientists, the question of whether the universe points to a designer has been a source of, like, legit intellectual debate, not just face-based claims.
Right, right. And that's kind of our mission for this deep dive, I guess. Not to settle the debate, but to map it out. Like what are the different shapes these arguments take? What are the main criticisms they face? And why does this whole design idea keep popping up even with those challenges?
Yeah, totally. It's less about taking sides and more about understanding the whole back and forth, the nuances of this really long-standing philosophical conversation.
Okay, so first things first, for anyone maybe just tuning into philosophy for the first time, what exactly are we talking about when we say teleological arguments?
So, at their core, they all start with a pretty basic observation, something most people can relate to. Nature seems to have this like order, beauty, even a kind of purpose to it. It's
Yeah.
like things are arranged for something, not just a random mess.
Yeah, it's like you almost can't help but see intention behind like the complexity of a flower or the way an ecosystem works.
Right. And Hume, that Scottish philosopher, he had this character, Cleanthes, who put it really well. We see the image of mind reflected on us from innumerable objects. So that feeling of mind-like order is kind of the starting point. But the real philosophical question is, does it logically lead to an intelligent source? Like, is that the only explanation?
Okay, so that makes sense. But for someone who's been following philosophy for a while, how do these differ from those cosmological arguments we often hear about, the ones also trying to show God's existence?
Ah, good question. It's important to keep them straight. So cosmological arguments usually focus on the fact that, like, the universe exists at all or that things in it depend on other things.
Mm.
They then argue for this first cause or a necessary being, right?
Like something had to get the whole ball rolling.
Exactly. But teleological arguments, they kind of zoom in on the specifics of the universe, the stuff in it, and they say, look, these features, this complexity, this apparent purpose, it screams design. It screams an intellect behind it.
So it's less about the why is there something rather than nothing question and more about the why is this something so incredibly intricate and seemingly well put together question.
And precisely. It's not just a cause, but a cause with, like, smarts, intention, a plan, someone or something that could actually design things that have these specific cool properties.
Okay, that's a helpful distinction. So like finding a rock might make you think, whoa, how did this rock even come to be? Which is more cosmological. But finding like a perfectly formed seashell, that might make you think, hold on, this seems intentionally crafted, which is getting into teleological territory.
Right on. And what's fascinating is we accept this kind of design inference all the time with human stuff. Like, you see a complex machine, a smartphone. You don't go, I wonder if it just appeared randomly. You assume a human designer.
For sure, for sure.
And even with potential alien stuff, like if we picked up a radio signal with some crazy mathematical structure, most folks wouldn't hesitate to think someone out there is sending this. The real debate, the real philosophical fireworks start when that designer is proposed to be, well, supernatural.
Yeah, that's where things get interesting for sure. Okay, so you mentioned these arguments have some historical weight. How seriously have philosophers actually taken them over time?
Well, honestly, they've been seen as some of the most, I guess you could say, intuitively appealing philosophical arguments for theism. The idea of a god, the order of the cosmos, of the complexity of life. It just seems to make sense to some folks that it's got to be more than just like blind chance at work.
Makes sense to me.
But, and this is important for us philosophers to remember, teleology doesn't automatically equal the traditional God idea. The core intuition, this sense of inherent purpose or mind-like stuff in nature, it could also fit with other ideas like panentheism, where God is kind of in everything, or even panpsychism, where consciousness is fundamental to reality itself. So there are options there.
Okay, so lots to unpack for us philosophy nerds, but before we go too far, we gotta acknowledge there's not just one type of teleological argument, right? There are different ways to make this design inference, different patterns.
Exactly. So the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is like a go-to resource for this kind of thing, they often break it down into three main schemas, three main ways to structure the argument. Let's start with what's called the analogical design argument, probably the most straightforward and historically influential one.
All right, schema one, analogical. Lay it on us. How does this one work?
So basically, you start by looking at something in nature, right? Let's call it, I don't know, EF or evidence, keeps it simple. You notice this, he has some features that look a lot like a human-made thing, an artifact, like, I don't know, a really complex clock, maybe?
Yeah.
And call that A.
Okay, so I've got nature's E and human-made A.
Right. And the key is they're alike in certain ways, certain respects. We can call those R relevant respects. Now, we know that the human-made thing, the A, has those R characteristics because someone designed it, right? An intelligent human made it that way.
Makes sense.
So the argument goes, if E and A are so alike in these R ways, and if similar effects usually have similar causes, then it's probable, not certain, but probable, that he also got those features from some kind of intelligent designer, someone or something kind of like a human mind, but maybe way more powerful.
Okay, so that's like the classic watchmaker analogy, right?
Yeah.
Nature is like a complex watch. Watches are made by watchmakers. Therefore, nature was probably made by a super watchmaker.
Okay, but there's a but.
Always a but in philosophy, right?
Pretty much. And this is where David Hume, that philosophical heavyweight, he comes in swinging,
Yeah.
He had some big problems with this line of reasoning.
Lay him on us.
Okay, so first, Hume's like, hold up. Is nature really that comparable to a human-made thing? He points out, like, living things, they grow, they reproduce, they're self-organizing. Machines, not so much. They need us to build and maintain them.
Yeah, that's a pretty fundamental difference.
Right. Hume even suggests, like, maybe the universe is more like a giant organism than a machine. And honestly, with what we know now about cosmology, the universe always changing and evolving, that comparison to an organism seems even more spot on.
Okay, so if the analogy is shaky to begin with, the whole argument built on it kind of falls apart. What else did Hume have a problem with?
Well, he said, even if we ignore that, there could be other explanations for order and complexity, right? Like chance or some natural processes we just haven't figured out yet. Just because something's ordered doesn't mean someone had to order it.
True, true.
And then he gets even more clever. He's like, fine, let's say they're IS, a designer. What does this analogy actually tell us about them? Doesn't mean this designer is perfect or all-powerful or even just one being. Maybe he was a bunch of clumsy gods who messed up a few times, hence all the, not-so-perfect stuff in nature.
Haha, right, like a cosmic design team that didn't quite nail the brief.
And, of course, then there's the big one. Who designed the designer, right? This leads to that infinite regress problem that philosophers always get tangled up in.
Yeah, the classic turtles all the way down situation.
Exactly. Plus, Hume's like, wait, even if this argument works, it only shows a designer of the universe's form, not necessarily the creator of the actual stuff it's made of. And on top of all that being an analogy, it's inductive reasoning, meaning it can only give you probability, never absolute certainty.
Okay, so Hume really went to town on this analogy thing.
Oh, he wasn't done. He also pointed out, like, we only have one universe to look at. How can we make any reliable generalizations about design based on a sample size of one? Plus, even our view of this one universe is limited in both time and space.
So basically, Hume said this analogical argument is way too quick to jump to conclusions. But didn't some philosophers push back on this?
They did. Some argued that Hume might have been a bit too strict with his analogy standards. They're like, look, in science, we make inferences that go beyond what we directly observe all the time. Like, think of how we figured out germs cause disease. We couldn't see germs back then, but we inferred they were there based on other evidence.
Right, sometimes you got to go beyond what you can see and touch to explain things.
Exactly. And they say, look, simplicity and explanatory power, those are important in science, even if it means using an analogy that might not be perfect.
Okay, so there's pushback. But it still seems like the whole thing kind of hinges on those specific, relevant respects, the R stuff. Like, what features of nature have philosophers actually pointed to as evidence for design?
Oh, all sorts of things. Some are more, like, empirical, based on observation, like the regularity of natural laws, the way organisms are perfectly suited to their environments, or the whole means to end thing, like how the eye is structured for vision. But some get a bit more philosophical, like the sheer complexity of some systems, the specific types of functionality, even the beauty and elegance of nature. Some folks see that as evidence.
Wow, so it's a real mixed bag of observations. All right, so that was schema 1, the analogy one. What's next on our philosophical design tour?
So next up is schema 2, deductive design arguments. And here things get a bit more, well, philosophically ambitious. Instead of comparing nature to stuff we make, this one says certain features within nature directly point to intention, to a mind. It's not an analogy anymore. It's like those features themselves are the evidence.
Okay, deductive. So we're going for more like airtight, logically necessary kind of argument here.
That's the idea. Think of it like this. You see a written text, right? Like the Gettysburg Address. You instantly know it's the product of a mind. Right? Not because you've seen tons of text and you know they're all written by people, but because the structure, the meaning in the words themselves, it just screams intentionality.
Yeah, you don't need to see someone writing it to know it was written.
Right. So these deductive design folks, they thought they could find similar mind-resonating features in nature, like complexity mixed with functionality, beauty, that kind of stuff. Said those things just are the kind of things minds produce.
Interesting. So Paley's watch argument, the one everyone always talks about, maybe it wasn't really meant as a straight-up analogy. Maybe he was aiming for something more like this deductive thing.
Yeah, you got it.
Yeah.
A lot of folks see Paley as just saying, nature's like a watch, so it needs a watchmaker. But if you read him closely, it's more subtle. He's saying, look, a watch is different from a random stone because its parts are clearly put together for a purpose. They're designed to tell time.
Okay, so it's less about comparing nature to a watch and more about applying the same logic we use to recognize design in a watch to nature itself.
Exactly. And Paley then does that with the eye, right? He's like, look, same principle here. This complex organ with all its parts working together for vision, that didn't just happen.
Okay, that's a pretty neat distinction. So what's the supposed advantage of this deductive way of arguing? Why go this route?
Well, two big reasons. First, it skips the whole analogy thing. No more worries about whether nature is really like a human-made object. And second, by focusing on the inherent features of things, the argument aims for a more certain, more logically solid conclusion.
Sounds bold. But what about the actual premises of the schema, too? Do those hold up to scrutiny?
Well, there are two main ones. First, that some things in nature really have this design-like quality, this mind-resonating character, however you want to phrase it. And what's funny is even some big opponents of design arguments, they admit this. Like Crick, the DNA guy, he actually warned biologists to remember that what they study wasn't designed. And Dawkins, the famous atheist, he even said biology is the study of things that give the appearance of being designed.
Huh. So it's not the appearance of design that's the issue, it's the explanation for that appearance.
Exactly. The second premise is the trickier one. It says these design-like properties can't be produced by just blind natural processes. That's where the real philosophical debate lies.
Yeah, how do you prove something can't happen?
Right. So the source lays out two main ways philosophers have tried to justify this. One is empirical, based on our experience. We look around, and pretty much every time we see something with these R characteristics, like intricate order, purpose, it turns out someone made it, right? It's an artifact. So we generalize that and say, well, same goes for nature.
Makes sense on the surface, but sounds like the same problem we had with the analogy thing. Our experience is limited, right?
You got it. It's mostly human-made stuff, so it's not the strongest philosophical basis. At best, it gives you probability, not certainty.
Okay, so what's the other way philosophers try to justify that second premise, that nature can't produce this stuff on its own?
The other way is more conceptual. Some philosophers say, we just know certain types of order imply a mind, like it's built into how we understand things. Back to the Gettysburg Address example, we don't need to actually see someone writing it to know a mind was behind it. So they argue some order in nature, the right kind of order, has that same inherent mind signature. Others say, look, we experience the link between mind and order constantly with human-made stuff, so it's reasonable to apply that same framework to nature.
So it's not just complexity, but the specific kind of complexity, the way it's arranged, that supposedly points to a designer.
Exactly. But the source also raises some important points here, like how much weight a specific R feature carries depends on the context. Finding crazy complexity in a human-made object is way more convincing than just seeing complexity in nature. Plus, critics say, natural examples aren't usually as clear-cut as, like, a written message.
Right. Nature's a bit messier than a carefully crafted artifact.
For sure. And this often leads to those God of the gaps arguments, which philosophers are always wary of.
Yeah, those are kind of infamous, right? Fill me in on how those work in this context.
So it's basically, if we see something in nature, some R feature that seems designed, but we don't have a good scientific explanation for it yet, some folks jump in and say, aha, that gap in our knowledge, that proves it's a designer, probably God.
But as you learn more about science, those gaps tend to shrink, right?
Exactly. That's the big problem with relying on those gaps as proof. What seems supernatural might just be natural processes we haven't fully grasped yet. And historically, that's happened a lot. Darwin's theory of evolution is a prime example. It explained all this biological complexity that used to seem like undeniable proof of God's design.
So it's philosophically risky to say, we don't know how this happened, therefore God did it.
Right. It's not logically wrong to say there are gaps in our knowledge, but to jump to a supernatural designer as the only answer, that's where things get shaky.
Yeah.
Especially when science, operating with this idea of finding natural explanations for natural things, has been so successful at filling those gaps.
Yeah, science has a pretty good track record there. Okay, so that brings us to the third type of design argument, schema 3. Inference to the best explanation, the abductive one.
Right. Schema 3. This one shifts the focus again. It's like, okay, maybe we can't prove design definitively, and maybe analogies have problems, but design might still be the best explanation for what we see.
Okay, so instead of trying to prove it directly, we're looking at all the options and saying which explanation makes the most sense.
Exactly. And they argue that the design hypothesis, the idea that some intelligent being shaped things, it just explains the complexity, the apparent fine-tuning, better than chance or necessity or even unguided evolution.
Makes sense, but best, that's a loaded word, right?
Oh,
How do you judge which explanation is best in some objective way?
that's a great question. And philosophers of science have spent a lot of time trying to nail down what makes one explanation better than another. They talk about things like likelihood, how likely is the evidence if the explanation is true. Explanatory power, like how much stuff can it explain. Simplicity, scope, all sorts of things.
Sounds complicated.
It is, because there's no universally agreed upon ranking of these criteria. Plus, it's a deeper philosophical issue, too. Why should the explanations we find appealing as humans necessarily be the true ones?
Yeah, our preferences don't dictate reality.
Right. But the source also connects this to Pierce's idea of abduction. He said abduction is like you see something surprising, and then you think, huh, if this other thing were true, that surprising thing would make total sense. And that gives you reason to suspect that other thing might be true.
So the surprising thing is like the order and complexity of the universe, and the other thing is the design hypothesis.
Exactly. And the concept of likelihood is key here. You're basically asking, how probable is it that we'd see this evidence if design were true? And there's this principle, the likelihood principle, that says if one explanation has a higher likelihood than another, then the evidence supports that first one more.
Makes sense. But does that automatically mean the higher likelihood explanation is the right one?
Not necessarily.
Yeah.
A really weird or even nonsensical theory could technically predict some specific evidence perfectly, making it seem likely for that one thing, but overall it could still be totally off base.
So just because design could explain some stuff doesn't mean it is the most likely or the best explanation overall.
Exactly. And Sober, another philosopher, he brings up a key point. Unless you make some pretty specific assumptions about the designer, like their goals, their methods, it's hard to even say how likely it is that they would design the things we see.
Right. It's like without knowing the designer's playbook, how can you even calculate the odds?
But then Jansen comes in and says, hey, the same issue applies to chance as an explanation. It's too vague, too undefined to really calculate its likelihood.
Mm.
So how do we assign probabilities to these big, abstract ideas? It's a philosophical mess.
Sounds like it. Okay, so we've got these three schemas, but then we got to talk about the elephant in the room, right? Darwin, evolution, the whole shebang.
Absolutely. Darwinian evolution, with its random variations and natural selection, it's given us a super powerful and well-supported way to explain why organisms are so perfectly adapted to their environments. And those adaptations are like many of the very R characteristics that design arguments have always pointed to.
So evolution offers a way to get complexity, apparent purpose, all that, without needing a designer.
Exactly. And this is where the idea of explaining away becomes crucial. The claim is that evolution has, in a sense, explained away the need for a designer in biology, like the same way we don't need the idea of caloric fluid to explain heat anymore.
But explaining away is a specific philosophical idea, right? It's not just about offering any alternative explanation.
Right. There are certain philosophical conditions that need to be met for one explanation to truly explain away another. Like, let's say, A is our original explanation, in this case design, and B is the new explanation, evolution. B has to be able to fully account for what we see. It's got to have solid evidence backing it up. It should ideally be a better explanation, simpler, more comprehensive. And crucially, it shouldn't need to refer back to A at any level.
Okay, so like if you originally think a flower blooms on Tuesdays because a gardener waters it every Monday.
Right. But then you find out the flower has this internal clock that's triggered by the sun and humidity, which happen to be just right every Tuesday, regardless of the gardener. The biological explanation makes the gardener's actions irrelevant. You know,
Hmm.
it explains it away. But if you later found out the gardener engineered that internal clock in the first place, well, then their design would still be part of the explanation, just at a different level.
Okay, that makes sense. So in the design debate, even if evolution explains how biological complexity works, some folks might say, well, it doesn't explain where the laws of physics that allow evolution to happen come from in the first place,
Right.
or the initial conditions of the universe. They might still argue for a designer at a more fundamental level.
Exactly. And this takes us back to the concept of indirect design, which has been a big part of these debates for a long time.
Okay, so indirect design, how does that work philosophically? Because it's not like the old school design folks thought God was constantly tinkering with every little thing.
Right, it's more subtle than that. Many design proponents, even Paley and those who wrote the Bridgewater treatises, they were totally fine with the idea of indirect design. They said, look, a wise designer could set up the universe, the laws of physics, from the get-go in a way that naturally leads to the results they want without needing to constantly step in and adjust things.
So, like a really good programmer who writes code that runs perfectly without needing constant updates.
Exactly. And even Bacon, way before Darwin, he said something similar. He said God works through natural laws, not by breaking them.
So, even if we can trace every step in a natural process, the original design could be in the setup itself, in those first principles.
Precisely. And philosophically, if those design features we see ultimately depend on some kind of intelligence setting the stage, then the exact way they came about is less important to the argument. This also addresses the God of the gaps problem because it doesn't rely on current gaps in our knowledge.
So, even if we knew everything about science, the question of whether those scientific laws were designed would still be open.
Right. So this leads to a kind of updated version of Schema 2, where the core idea is design-like features probably can't be produced by things that are ultimately free of mind or intention. It's about the origin of everything, not just the specific steps along the way.
And this connects to those modern arguments about fine tuning, right? The idea that the universe's basic settings seem perfectly calibrated for life.
Exactly. Like, think of the cosmological constant. It controls how fast the universe expands. And physicists have calculated that if it were even slightly different, the universe would either fly apart too quickly for stars and galaxies to form, or it would collapse in on itself. Either way, no life as we know it.
That's a pretty narrow window. What are some other examples of this fine tuning?
Well, there's the strength of the strong nuclear force, which holds the centers of atoms together. It's got to be just right for carbon and oxygen to form in stars, and those are like the essential building blocks for life. Mess with that force a tiny bit, and you get a very different, probably lifeless, universe.
So it's like a whole bunch of cosmic dials that all have to be set in these incredibly specific positions for life to be possible. And the argument is that just seems way too improbable to be a coincidence.
Right. And Smolin, a physicist, he actually calculated the probability of stars forming given all these precise constants, and it's ridiculously small. He basically said, this can't just be luck, we need a real explanation. And for a lot of folks, that explanation is design.
But philosophers love to play devil's advocate, right? So what are some of the counter arguments to this fine-tuning thing?
Oh, there are plenty. One of the big ones is the weak anthropic principle, which basically says, look, we can only observe a universe that allows for life, because if it didn't, we wouldn't be here to observe it. So maybe our surprise at finding ourselves in such a seemingly improbable universe is misplaced.
It's like that old saying, if a tree falls in the forest and no one's around to hear it, doesn't make a sound. If a universe exists that can't support life and there's no one there to observe it, does it even matter, philosophically speaking?
Exactly. And then there's Sober, who came up with this idea of an observational selection effect. He's like, imagine a net with holes that only catch big fish. The fact that a fisherman only catches big fish doesn't mean all the fish are big, just that his net only selects for those. So maybe our existence is kind of like that net. We can only observe universes where life is possible, even if those are super rare in the grand scheme of things.
So we're biased by our very existence.
Right. But some people push back on this, saying the degree of fine-tuning is way more precise than just what's needed for any life. They're like, it's so specific to our kind of life, it can't be just a selection effect.
Okay, so back and forth we go. What about those arguments that challenge whether probability even applies in this case?
Yeah, some philosophers get really into the weeds here. They say, look, if the range of possible values for those constants is infinite, then talking about the probability of our specific universe becomes meaningless. Like, how do you calculate the odds of winning a lottery with infinite tickets?
My brain hurts just thinking about that.
Uh-huh, yeah. But then others come in with fancier math, like measure theory, to try and show that even with infinite possibilities, the set of values that allow for life might still be incredibly tiny, like a zero probability event. But even then, choosing the right way to measure those possibilities gets philosophical and messy.
Okay, so it's a real head scratcher. Besides theistic design, what other explanations do people offer for this fine-tuning?
Well, some folks, especially those who like naturalism, the idea that everything can be explained by natural processes, they're kind of banking on future science to figure it out. They're like, look, maybe there's some deeper law of physics we haven't discovered yet that explains why those constants have to be that way, and it'll all make sense eventually.
So a bit of a wait-and-see approach.
Yeah, but as of now, it's more of a hope than a concrete explanation. Then there's the idea of maybe, just maybe, there are other kinds of life out there that could exist even if those constants were different. But even that idea has issues because those constants seem to control the very basic conditions for complexity and energy use, which most folks think are essential for any kind of life.
Right. Life as we know it, at least, needs those things. And then there's the multiverse, right? The idea that there are tons of universes with different settings, and we just happen to be in the lucky one.
Exactly. The multiverse is super popular these days, both in science and philosophy. The idea is if there are enough universes, even with random settings, then statistically some of them are bound to be life permitting, and we just happen to be in one of those.
So we won the cosmic lottery.
In a way, yeah. But the source makes a good point. The multiverse alone doesn't necessarily solve everything. You still got to explain how all those universes popped up in the first place and if that process itself involved any design. Plus, there's this weird thing philosophers talk about called Boltzmann brains.
Boltzmann brains.
Yeah, it's this wild idea that in a huge multiverse, random fluctuations could, like, spontaneously produce brains with consciousness. And some argue that there might be way more of these random brains than normal ones like ours, which would kind of screw up our whole idea of what's real and what we can trust about our observations.
That is trippy. Okay, so lots of back and forth on the fine-tuning front. And then there's the more recent intelligent design movement in biology. Where does that fit into all of this?
So ID is a modern attempt to revive design arguments using, like, current science. They look at things like DNA and complex biological systems and say, look, this just screams design.
Okay, so they're pointing to new gaps in our scientific knowledge that they say support design.
Sort of. They often focus on two things: irreducible complexity and specified complex information. Irreducible complexity is the idea that some biological systems are so intricate they couldn't have evolved gradually. It's like they need all their parts to function, so how could they have developed step by step?
All right, kind of like a mousetrap.
Exactly. And specified complex information, that's mainly about the information encoded in DNA. ID folks say that kind of information is a hallmark of intelligence, not random processes. But we got to acknowledge that ID gets a lot of pushback from mainstream science and philosophy.
Yeah, it's pretty controversial.
Big time. Critics say ID distorts current science, its evidence is weak, and that evolution does a much better job explaining things. They also accuse ID of being like sneaky creationism dressed up as science.
So not a lot of love for ID in the scientific community.
Not really. But the source makes a point that's worth thinking about. Even if ID isn't good science, that doesn't automatically mean all design arguments are wrong.
Right, just because one approach is flawed doesn't invalidate the entire concept.
Exactly. Some philosophers say, look, science has its limits. It's great for figuring out how things work, but maybe it's not the best tool for answering why things are the way they are, or if there's a deeper purpose behind it all.
So even if ID's methods are off, the big questions about design might still be valid philosophical questions.
Right. And that leads to another interesting question. If all these design arguments have problems, why do they keep popping up? Why do they feel so intuitively compelling to some
Yeah,
people?
it's like a philosophical zombie that just won't die.
Huh, totally. So one possibility is that maybe some of these arguments, especially the more nuanced ones, have more philosophical weight than their critics give them credit for. But another idea, and this is pretty wild, is that maybe the feeling of design isn't even based on reasoning or inference at all.
Wait, what if it's not inference, what is it?
Well, think about how we know the world outside our minds is real, or that other people have thoughts and feelings, we don't like logically deduce those things. It's more like a basic gut level certainty.
Yeah, I don't sit around proving to myself that the chair I'm sitting on is real.
Yeah,